The snow had fallen softly over Lochdob, turning the village into a hushed postcard, just as the bells rang in the new year. Inside the village hall warmth and noise collided, fiddles shrieked, boots stamped, and laughter ricocheted off the low ceiling. At the heart of it all sat the Hogmanay table, laid with shortbread, black bun, and the silver quaich that held the ceremonial first toast of the year. It was an old custom, older than most could remember, and fiercely guarded. The quaich was filled moments before midnight with a rare malt, uncorked, by the provost himself, then placed dead centre on the table. No one was to touch it until the bells finished, and the first footer stepped forward. When the last chime faded and the cheers surged, the provost raised his hands for quiet and reached for the quaich. His fingers closed on nothing. The silver bowl was gone. At first it was laughed off. Someone suggested too much whisky had been drunk already, that the provost had misplaced his hand, but the table was bare save for crumbs and damp rings. The quaich, heavy, engraved, unmistakable, had vanished. The laughter thinned, then stopped altogether. A murmur spread, uneasy and sharp. The doors to the hall had been bolted against the cold, as they always were once the dancing began. Windows were shut tight, rimmed with frost. No one remembered seeing anyone leave. The provost went pale. That quaich was not just silver, it was the symbol of the village. Luck for the coming year. Losing it on Hogmanay was an omen no one wanted. He ordered the music stopped. The hall fell into an awkward silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. People were counted, names called. Everyone who had entered before midnight was still present. The caretaker swore on his mother's grave that the doors hadn't been opened. Someone suggested a prank, but no one laughed. Then there was the smell. Near the table, faint but distinct, hung the sharp, medicinal tang of peat smoke and oranges whisky certainly, but not the malt that had been poured. That bottle sat empty under the table, its cork still snug beside it. Whatever scent lingered was wrong. A woman bent down and pointed. On the polished floor, half hidden beneath a chair, lay a scrap of red wool, torn cleanly as if from a sleeve. Arguments flared. Accusations darted like midges. The provost commanded the police. Word travelled fast in Lochdob, faster than the snow could fall, and before the clock reached one, Constable Hamish Macbeth was being dragged from his quiet celebration at the police house. Hamish arrived red-cheeked and irritated, his greatcoat half-buttoned, a paper crown still perched crookedly on his head. He took in the scene with a long, resigned sigh, the crowded hall, the anxious faces, the empty space on the table that seemed to hum with importance. He listened as the provost explained, eyes flicking now and then to the red wool on the floor. Hamish crouched, careful not to disturb anything, and sniffed the air. "That's not your malt," he said mildly. "Smells more like a blend. Cheap one, too." He stood and surveyed the hall. No broken windows, no open doors. Snow outside lay smooth and untouched, a white sheet that would have betrayed any hurried escape. He picked up the scrap of wool between thumb and forefinger. "Anyone here missing a bit of red?" he asked. Several people glanced around. No one answered. Most were dressed in dark winter clothes, greens, browns, blacks. Red was conspicuously absent. The caretaker insisted again that no one had left. Hamish checked the bolts himself, then the windows. All secure. He looked back at the table. The quaich had been heavy, awkward to hide. Slipping it under a coat unnoticed in that crush would have been no small feat, and yet it was gone without a clatter, without a shout, as the villagers talked over one another. Hamish's gaze drifted to the fire. A log shifted, sending up a brief flare. For a moment he thought he saw something glint within the ash, then it was gone. He said nothing, straightened, and asked everyone to stay put a little longer. Whatever had happened, it had been done quietly, cleverly, and right under everyone's noses. And in a village like Lochdob, that made it far more troubling than a simple theft, Hamish learned. The murmuring rise and fall around him like the tide, his expression mild to the point of boredom. Villagers mistook that look for inattention, which suited him fine. He walked the perimeter, the hall slowly, boots scuffing the floor, eyes drifting everywhere at once. Most constables would have started with questions, notebooks out, voices firm. Hamish preferred to let the room talk first. He paused by the fire again, crouching low. The ash had settled now, grey and soft. Using a poker, he gently prodded near the back. Something metallic chimed faintly. Several heads turned. Hamish drew out a blackened shard no bigger than his thumb, its edges warped by heat. He rubbed it clean on his sleeve. Silver gleamed beneath the suit, etched with a familiar curling pattern, just a fragment. He said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. A gasp rippled through the onlookers. The provost pushed forward, face tight. "That's from the quaich," he said. That's the design. Aye, Hamish replied. Part of it, anyway. The idea that the ceremonial cup had been burned sent a fresh wave of outrage through the hall. Voices rose. Theories collided. Someone demanded to know who would dare commit such sacrilege. Another swore no one had gone near the fire all night, except the caretaker. Hamish turned to the caretaker, a thin man with a worried face and permanently stooped shoulders. "You've been feeding the fire regular?" he asked. "Aye, constable." "Same as always. Last log was put on just before the bells. And you didn't notice anything odd?" The caretaker shook his head too quickly. "Just wood. Same stack I always use." Hamish nodded, then wandered to the woodpile stacked near Cly by the wall. He lifted a log, then another. Most were dry pine, but one near the bottom was darker, heavier, and smelled faintly of spirits. He sniffed it, then tapped it against the floor. It rang dully. He set it aside without comment. Across the room, he noticed Morag Mac Innes standing apart from the others. She had arrived late, just before midnight, breathless and flushed, wrapped in a red wool coat. Or rather, what remained of it. Her sleeve was torn near the cuff, the edge rough and fresh. Hamish's eyes lingered there, then slid to her face. She was watching him too closely, as if gauging how much he saw. Hamish ambled over. "Cold night for rushing," he said lightly. "You catch that on the door?" Morag blinked. "What?" He gestured to her sleeve. "That tear." She looked down, colour rising in her cheeks. "Oh, I must have. I didn't notice." "Funny," Hamish said. "I found a bit of red wool on the floor near the table. Looked about the same." Her mouth opened, then closed again. "Lots of folk wear red," she said, too quickly. Hamish smiled, apologetic. True enough, still funny coincidence. He left her there, fingers worrying at the torn cuff, and moved toward the table once more. He crouched and examined the floorboards beneath it. A dark stain had soaked into the wood, nearly invisible under the scuffs and footprints. He touched it, brought his fingers to his nose. Not the malt. The cheaper blend again. Sharp and raw. Someone had spilled whiskey deliberately, he thought. UGHD. Or used it for something else. Sergeant Morrison from the nearest town finally arrived, stamping snow from his boots and immediately taking charge in the loud, officious way Hamish disliked. He ordered statements, had the doors checked again, declared the hall a crime scene. Hamish let him. Routine had its place, and Morrison's booming presence kept everyone distracted. While the sergeant argued with the provost, Hamish slipped back to the fire. He nudged the ash once more and uncovered another fragment, then another small, twisted bits of silver, scattered as if something larger had been broken apart hastily. Burning silver took time and heat. Whoever had done this hadn't meant to destroy the quoich completely, just enough to make it vanish. Hamish straightened slowly. His gaze drifted back to Morag, then to the caretaker, then to the door that led to the small kitchen behind the hall. It was ajar now, though he was certain it had been closed earlier. From within came the faint drip of water and the lingering smell of cleaning spirits. He felt the first true tug of the mystery then, the sense that the simple theft everyone feared was nothing of the sort. Someone had wanted the toast to vanish, not the silver itself. And in a village that believed deeply in omens, that kind of mischief or malice meant more than bad luck. Hamish glanced once more at the scattered silver in his palm and slipped it into his pocket. The deception was there now, thin cracks showing through the surface. He just had to follow them carefully, before the village tore itself apart, trying to guess what the missing toast meant for the year ahead. Hamish waited until Sergeant Morrison had everyone lined up along the wall, faces drawn tight by suspicion and cold, before he began to ask his question. Morrison's notebook was already open, pen scratching briskly as names and times were recorded, but Hamish took no notes at all. He leaned back against the table where the quoich had sat, arms folded, listening. The caretaker went first. His account was precise to the point of stiffness. He had arrived early, laid the fire, checked the doors, checked them again. No one had gone near the hearth after the bells. When Hamish asked him what sort of wood he'd used, the man frowned. Same as always, pine and a bit of birch. No darker logs? Hamish asked mildly. The caretaker hesitated, then shook his head. If there was one, it must have been mixed in by mistake. Must there? Hamish echoed, and moved on. Morag Mac Innes was next. She clasped her hands together so tightly her knuckles shone white. She explained her lateness in a rush. Her aunt had taken ill, the road had been icy. She'd nearly turned back. She'd come straight into the hall, found a place by the wall, spoken to no one until the bells rang. When Hamish asked where she'd been standing exactly, She pointed to a spot that would have given her a clear view of the table. "And did you see anyone near it?" he asked. "No," she said. ID, too fast again. Everyone was dancing. Hamish tilted his head. "Funny thing about that," he said gently. "The floor by the table wasn't scuffed much. Most folks stayed clear of it." Her eyes flicked to the floor, then away. "I wouldn't know." Others followed. A fisherman who claimed he never left his seat. A shopkeeper who insisted she'd seen someone bend near the table, but couldn't say who. Each story sounded plausible on its own, but when Hamish began to repeat details back to them, times, positions, movements, the seams showed. One man swore the provost had poured the whiskey just before midnight. Another was certain it had been done earlier. A woman insisted she'd smelled smoke long before the bells, then changed her mind. When Morrison frowned, the most eager of them all was the provost himself. He offered his movements minute by minute, his voice ringing with righteous outrage. He spoke of tradition, of the insult done to the village, of the need to make an example. He was so intent on convincing everyone of his innocence that he forgot to be offended when Hamish asked whether he'd noticed the smell of the wrong whiskey. "I don't drink blends," the provost said sharply. "But you know the smell," Hamish replied. "Enough to notice it wasn't yours." The provost opened his mouth, then closed it. "Perhaps," he said stiffly. Hamish let that hang in the air. As the questioning wore on, the hall grew colder. Breath steamed. Tempers frayed. Hamish felt the pressure building, the unspoken fear that the missing toast meant something terrible was coming. That fear made liars careless. He circled back to Morag once more. "You said you spoke to no one before the bells," he said. "Yet Mrs. Calder there recalls asking you for a match." Morag stared at him. I don't remember that." Mrs. Calder bristled. "I did. She was near the kitchen door." Hamish. Gaze slid to that door again. The faint smell of cleaning spirits still drifted through the gap. "And did you go into the kitchen at any point?" he asked Morag. "No," she said, then faltered. "Well, just to wash my hands." "Before or after midnight?" "After." "No, before." "I'm not sure." Hamish nodded as if satisfied, though he was anything but. Too many slips now. Too much uncertainty from someone who claimed to remember everything else so clearly. He turned, instead, to the caretaker. "You said the last log went on just before the bells." "Aye." "And you were alone when you did it?" The caretaker swallowed. "Mostly." "Mostly?" The man's eyes darted to Morag, then away. "She was passing by?" "That's all." Morag stiffened. "I was not." Hamish raised a hand, calming them both. "Easy now." He stepped back, letting the argument simmer. In his mind, pieces were beginning to align, not neatly, not yet, but enough to suggest intent rather than impulse. Someone had been near the fire. Someone had access to the kitchen and its cleaning spirits. Someone had reason to want the toast gone, even if the silver itself meant little. As Morrison wrapped up the formal statements, Hamish looked around the hall one last time. Faces avoided his gaze now. Words had been spoken too freely, and everyone knew it. Whatever the truth was, it lay buried beneath their versions of events, distorted by fear and old grievances. Hamish felt certain of one thing: the vanishing toast was no prank. It was a message, and before morning came, he intended to know exactly who had sent it, and why. Hamish left the hall with a measured pace, boots crunching in the snow outside. The village seemed peaceful again under its blanket of white, but he knew better. Inside, every warm hearth, every familiar face, was a potential knot in the web of motives he had to untangle. He walked slowly toward the small lane that led past the old smithy, thinking aloud as he went. The quaich hadn't been taken by accident. Someone had planned it. But why? And why choose the first toast of the year, a moment so public, so symbolic? He began retracing the chain of interactions he'd observed. Morag Mac Innes, late to the hall, sleeve torn, nervous, with an inconsistent story. The caretaker, conscientious yet evasive in details about the logs and the fire. The provost, desperate to assert his innocence while showing more fear for the loss of tradition than the potential danger behind it. Then the others, the fisherman, the shopkeeper. The curious villagers each had small deviations in their accounts. On its own, none of these seemed damning, but together. EY suggested opportunity and intent scattered among several hands. Hamish knew that's how deception thrived, scattered responsibility, hidden behind plausibility. He thought about Morag first, red wool torn and left on the floor, the excuse of a hurried arrival, and the convenient near forgetfulness of visiting the kitchen just enough to create doubt. What could she gain? Jealousy, perhaps, though of what? Hamish remembered whispered remarks about her annoyance with the provost over village decisions. Was it simple resentment magnified by timing, or something more deliberate? The caretaker's motive was subtler. He had access to the fire, knowledge of the hall's every nook, and an easy story to tell. Who would suspect the quiet man who prided himself on routine? Hamish recalled overhearing him grumble about the provost's criticism over last year's Hogmanay arrangements. A simmering grudge might not justify a full theft, but it could explain tampering, misdirection, even minor sabotage. Then there was the provost himself, a man whose fear and zeal made him a potential actor in his own scandal. Could he have orchestrated the loss to reinforce the gravity of tradition, to bind the village more tightly under his authority? Hamish didn't dismiss the possibility. Power, especially when combined with fear of public disgrace, could be a potent motivator. Hamish paused, letting the cold bite at his cheeks. He pictured the table again, the empty space, the scattered silver, the faint air. Tains of the wrong whiskey, the smell of peat and citrus. Whoever had done this had thought through the details. The plan had been deliberate, but it hadn't gone entirely as intended. The fragments of silver, the wool, the misplaced smell, all of it betrayed small cracks in the deception. He walked back toward the hall, peering into the kitchen. A broom leaned lazily against the wall. A cloth lay damp from use, scent of spirits lingering. He noted the simple tools of ordinary cleaning could conceal extraordinary tampering. A log stacked in the corner, heavy and dark, could hide small items. Every ordinary object in Lochtub seemed suddenly capable of mischief when placed in the right or wrong hands. Hamish drew all of it together in his mind. No single suspect explained everything. Morag had the sleeve, the access, the nervous timing. The caretaker had opportunity and grudges. The provost had fear and authority. Even casual villagers might have seen something, taken advantage, or been used as distractions. The story had layers, and every layer concealed a motive tangled with another S. Jealousy, resentment, fear, and perhaps greed all intersected. Someone wanted to manipulate the village, but exactly how, and who benefited most, remained unclear. He returned to the hall, letting the snow crunch behind him, and examined the scattered fragments again. The small silver pieces reflected the lamplight in deceptive ways, twisting what little they revealed. Hamish could almost see the outline of a plan behind them, like smoke-forming shapes before dissipating. The solution, he knew, would require patience, observation, and a careful untangling of every alibi, every excuse, every tiny detail that no one else thought to question. He straightened, hands clasped behind his back, and let the villagers murmur around him. Every face he passed now could hide intent, and every word spoken could be masking truth. The maze of motives stretched in every direction, a tangle of opportunity and desire. Somewhere in that maze, the Vanishing Hogmanay toast was waiting to be explained, and Hamish Macbeth intended to find the path through, thread by thread, lie by lie. Hamish lingered in the hall long after most of the villagers had been sent home, the fire sputtering low and the cold creeping through the unsealed windows. He watched Sergeant Morrison's team bustling about with a fresh fragment of silver that had been found tucked into the chimney, proclaiming it a breakthrough. The sergeant's voice boomed, and villagers nodded along, relief spreading like spilled whiskey. The quote had been recovered, sort of. It was shattered, yes, but in fragments that could be collected and reforged. The worst of the crisis seemed over, and already the gossip spun tales of confession and punishment. Morag Mac Innes, the caretaker, and even the provost were caught up in the apparent resolution. The villagers lined up to shake the sergeant's hand, their murmurs of panic giving way to praise. They believed the mystery solved, that the thief's hand had been exposed in the ash-filled fragments, in the hurriedly discovered pieces. The hall, once tense, relaxed. The music had been restarted, cautious at first, then with a tentative cheer. Hamish watched the celebration from the corner, hands tucked deep into his coat pockets, expression neutral. He should have joined in the relief, even smiled. But something in the fragments, in the casual way the sergeant had claimed victory, prickled at him. The silver shards didn't tell the story he expected. They were scattered almost deliberately, too perfectly placed, as if someone had staged the scene to be found. There were no hidden crumbs of truth in the way a real criminal panics, no chaotic traces that scream guilt. The fire hadn't been forced or misused beyond expectation. The path to the fragments was too neat. Hamish could almost hear the careful planning behind it, a hand smoothing over the missteps, leaving only the faintest trail. He crouched near the hearth, careful not to disturb the assembly. His eyes roamed over the floor, past the scattered silver, and toward the red scrap of wool he had pocketed earlier. It hadn't appeared in the official report. The investigators had overlooked it entirely, treating it as nothing more than an accident, but Hamish remembered how it had been torn, fresh and jagged. Someone had brushed against the table in haste or carelessness, or perhaps in feigned innocence. He ran his finger over it again. The wool was a clue, yes, but not one meant to be followed. It had been left there intentionally, a red herring to draw attention away from the real trail. The criminal had anticipated the villagers' panic and the authorities' eagerness for closure. The provost, flushed with victory, strode over to inspect the fragments himself, voice trembling with self-importance. "See," he said, "the quaich may be damaged, but the problem is solved. We can patch it, and no ill omen will remain." His words carried relief, but Hamish noticed the twitch in his eye, the tiny hesitation before. He spoke a flicker of fear, or perhaps recognition that someone else's hand had been at work. Hamish didn't miss it. "Ah," Morrison declared, waving a hand toward the fragments. Case closed. "Villagers, you may relax." The cheer rose again. The smell of spirits, burned wood, and whisky seemed to settle into the air as if the hall itself exhaled in relief. Hamish remained still, listening to the room. The villagers' voices mingled with the crackle of the fire and the tinkle of glasses. Something nagged at the edge of his thoughts, a sense of false calm. The missing quaich, the wrong whisky, the torn wool, the precise way the fragments had been placed, all pieces of a puzzle that didn't yet reveal the picture he expected. He could feel it. The criminal was still at large, lurking in the shadows, watching the chaos they had sown. They had misdirected everyone with a neat display of apparent clue. Yes, confident that the excitement and the authorities' pronouncement would bury the truth for good, Hamish straightened and glanced around the room once more. Everyone else had accepted the easy story, the one that gave them comfort, but the first footstep of deception, he knew, will always small, subtle. And the real trail, the one that would reveal the orchestrator of the Vanishing Hogmanay toast, was hidden, waiting for the moment when the villager's guard was down. He slipped the red wool fragment into his pocket, eyes narrowing slightly. It was a silent promise to himself. The solution was not in the fragments the sergeant hailed as victory. The truth lay elsewhere, in the shadows of the hall, in the half-truths whispered between the dancers, in the quiet movements no one noticed. And Hamish Macbeth would follow it carefully, patiently, until the real culprit revealed themselves. And the village understood that this was far from over. Hamish walked out into the quiet streets of Locked-up, after the hall emptied, snow crunching softly underfoot, the cold air sharpening his thoughts. The village seemed to sleep, but his mind churned with the threads he had gathered. The false victory celebrated inside gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the sense that the quake's disappearance wasn't a simple act of mischief. Something deeper, older, was at play. He passed the edge of the loch, where the frozen water reflected the pale moonlight, and his mind drifted back to another Hogmanay year, hours ago, when a similar theft had stirred this same village. The story had never made the newspapers, just local whispers, quickly buried, but Hamish remembered it. The provost's father had presided over that year's celebration, and the village's ceremonial silver had gone missing under almost identical circumstances. A public celebration, a stolen symbol, and a clever misdirection that left the authorities satisfied with the wrong conclusion. That case had been quietly closed, the silver found months later in pieces near the hearth of the old hall. The parallels were too strong to ignore. Hamish's eyes narrowed. Could the current provost have inherited more than just his father's office? Could he also be carrying old grievances, old rivalries, old motives hidden beneath the veneer of civic duty? And Morag Mackin's her family had been embroiled, if indirectly, in that earlier theft. A business dispute, quiet resentment, a lingering bitterness that no one spoke of now. Suddenly, the torn sleeve in her inconsistent story took on new weight. He recalled the caretaker, too. Stooped and quiet, but present every Hogmanay for decades. He had been there during the previous theft as well, though only as an observer, or so he claimed. Perhaps he remembered more than anyone admitted, and perhaps he had carried a grudging loyalty or a secret grudge that had guided his hands this year. Hamish's gaze swept over the village rooftops, as if looking for echoes of those old grudges in the chimneys and the empty streets. Inside the hall, the fragments of silver, now safely collected, lay inert and cold. Hamish returned to examine them, lifting one and turning it in the lamplight. He noticed a small engraving at the edge, nearly invisible, a mark he hadn't seen before. Not a maker's mark, but a symbol, a flourish that matched an old sketch he had once glimpsed in the provost family papers, part of a ledger that chronicled the village's ceremonial silver over decades. The mark had always been ignored, dismissed as decoration, but now it felt like a signature, a deliberate stamp connecting past and present. Hamish crouched again, the draught from the windows raising goosebumps along his arms. The red wool in his pocket reminded him that someone had deliberately left traces, hints meant to mislead. But why leave any trace at all if the plan was purely for misdirection? It suggested someone wanted certain eyes to see the wrong path, while the real path remained hidden, entwined with the village's older disputes. The provost, Morag, the caretaker, they were all connected through history, through grudges and loyalties and debts no one outside Lochtub could fully understand. Hamish straightened, eyes sharp. The crime wasn't just about a missing quake or a failed toast. It was about power, about old resentments carried silently through generations, about lessons passed down like heirlooms in plain sight. Someone had used the chaos of the present whiskey, fire, torn sleeve, to mask a plan rooted in the past. The ingenuity of the misdirection was remarkable, almost elegant, but it didn't hide everything. He could feel the threads now, tangled yet coherent, linking the suspects in ways no one had yet seen. Old business disputes, family rivalries, inherited grudges, these were the shadows under which the crime had been conceived. And the criminal, whoever they were, was counting on everyone being distracted by the immediate panic, the missing quaich, the fragments. While the true motive and the connections went unnoticed, Hamish turned back toward the street, the village quiet and trusting around him. He had glimpsed the outlines of the past in the present, the way it shaped actions and decisions, and he knew the hunt was far from over. The real criminal was still there, somewhere in Lochtub, carefully watching, perhaps even smiling at the false triumph celebrated in the hall. And Hamish Macbeth would need every ounce of patience, every memory of history, to untangle the past and bring the truth into the light. Hamish returned to the hall the next morning, the air crisp with frost and the lingering scent of charred wood. While the villagers busied themselves with clearing up and repairing the decorations, he had other concerns. The fragments of silver, the red scrap of wool, the faint scent of blended whiskey all were pieces of a puzzle he knew would not yield to conventional questioning alone. He needed a tactic that bypassed excuses and rehearsed Ed's stories, something to unearth the truths people had buried even from themselves. He laid the fragments carefully across the table, arranging them to roughly mirror the original quaich, leaving gaps where pieces were still missing. Then he gathered the remaining witnesses, not to interrogate them formally, but to observe their reactions in an informal setting. He began by telling the villagers a story, a subtle fiction designed to provoke thought. He described a theft from years ago, a case with eerily similar circumstances, where the thief had left a single, telling clue, a torn piece of red cloth, and no one had noticed until it was too late. He left the story hanging, deliberately omitting the resolution. Most of the villagers listened politely, their eyes flicking to the fragments and then away, minds caught up in the story. Hamish watched them closely, noticing small reactions, a shift of weight, a flush of the cheeks, a tightening of the hands. Most remained neutral, but Morag Mac Innes, standing near the fire with her coat collar drawn high, tensed noticeably, her fingers curling slightly as if to hide them. Curious, Hamish said aloud, almost to himself, though everyone heard. Imagine, if you will, that the thief was still among us. Wouldn't it be fascinating if they had left a trace so subtle that only a keen eye might notice it? Morag's eyes flicked toward the table, then darted away. She smiled faintly, too quickly, and glanced down at the floor as if checking for something invisible. Hamish's gaze followed her movements, noting the precision of her glance, the almost imperceptible pause in her breathing. The story had acted as a mirror, and she had stared too long at her own reflection in it. He picked up the blackened log he had inspected earlier and let it rest on the table near the fragments. Sometimes, he said, tapping the log lightly, the most telling evidence is silver or cloth or even fire, but what people do with ordinary objects. A glance, a hesitation, the urge to touch something that isn't theirs. He leaned back and watched. Morag shifted again, this time brushing against the table, and a tiny piece of ash fell onto the floor, unnoticed by anyone else. Hamish's eyes followed it. He crouched and picked it up, examining it under the lamplight. Embedded in the ash was a small fleck of gold, a minuscule fragment of the decorative inlay that had adorned the quaich's baser piece, that had clearly come from someone handling the silver too closely. Interesting, Hamish murmured, as if to himself, though Morag's sharp intake of breath betrayed recognition. Her eyes widened slightly, and her hand tightened on the sleeve of her coat, tugging it down in a gesture meant to appear casual. The psychological test had worked. The casual story and the placement of objects had caused her to reveal. More than words ever would, he stood and addressed the room again, voice gentle but deliberate. Sometimes we think small mistakes go unnoticed. Sometimes the most careful hands betray themselves in the tiniest ways, and sometimes the truth hides in what people believe is invisible. Morag's eyes met his for the briefest instant, then flicked away. That was the crack he had been waiting for. Hamish pocketed the fleck of gold, feeling the pieces of the puzzle shift subtly in his mind. He had expected deception, carefully constructed stories, and false leads, but the human element, the reactions, the instinctive betrayals, provided the edge he needed. The criminal had planned meticulously, but the unconscious mind, the reflexive gesture, could not be controlled with the same precision as the villagers murmured around him, convinced they had contributed little more than information already recorded. Hamish stood quietly, observing the subtle movements, the tiny inconsistencies. He knew now that the real trail was finally within reach. The unconventional clue, the fleck of gold hidden in ash, had illuminated a path, and for the first time the outline of the person behind the Vanishing Hogmanay toast became unmistakably clear. Hamish had barely slipped the fleck of gold into his coat pocket when a sudden commotion erupted at the far end of the hall. A group of villagers had gathered near the hearth, voices raised in alarm. The provost's voice cut through the din, sharp without age. The fragments. Someone's taken them. Hamish strode forward, heart steady despite the sudden surge of tension. The tray that had held the collected silver shards was now empty, save for a few blackened ashes from the fire. The carefully preserved pieces were gone, vanished as thoroughly as the quake itself. He bent to inspect the remnants, noting immediately that the scorch marks on the floor matched those of the hearth. Someone had acted quickly, removing the fragments under the pretense of ordinary movement, using the chaos of the morning as cover. Morrison barked orders, flustered and red-faced. "Everyone stay where you are. No one leaves." But the villagers murmured nervously, glancing at one another, unsure whom to trust. Hamish's eyes swept the room, noting who reacted with too much calm, who shifted uncomfortably, who tried to appear disinterested, but failed. "Tell me exactly what happened," Hamish said softly to the provost, kneeling beside him to examine the empty tray. "When did you last see the fragments?" "Just a moment ago," the provost said, panic creeping into his voice. "I, Morrison, they were right here. I set them down myself." His hands trembled. "They can't just vanish." Hamish glanced toward Morag, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd. She drew a quick breath and stepped back, pretending to adjust her coat, but her eyes betrayed the slightest flicker of tension. She wasn't the only one. The caretaker, usually so composed, kept glancing nervously toward the kitchen door, the scene, the hall, every exit and entrance. Hamish crouched beside the hearth again, studying the floor. There were faint scuff marks, too faint for most, but to him they spoke volumes. Someone had slid the tray, carried it, perhaps even dropped it briefly, and then vanished, before anyone noticed. No footprints led outside. Whoever had taken the fragments had a way of moving silently, deliberately. With intimate knowledge of the hall's layout, he rose slowly, scanning the room. "This isn't random," he said, voice quiet but carrying. "Someone wants these fragments gone destroyed or hidden before anyone can piece the story together. They know what we've discovered, and they're working to bury it." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. Panic was returning, sharper this time. The false confidence of yesterday had evaporated. Hamish felt the subtle tremor of fear settle over the crowd. Trust, always fragile in a village like Lockdub, now felt as fragile as the silver itself. Morrison, flustered and unsure, insisted on searching the hall again, dragging villagers from corner to corner. Hamish let them busy themselves, noting quietly where their attention faltered. There were places Morrison never checked thoroughly: behind the stacked chairs, under the tables, in the shadowed recesses by the kitchen door. Hamish moved deliberately, kneeling and sweeping his fingers along the floor, smelling for subtle traces of ash or whiskey, watching for any unnatural movements. A flash of red at the edge of his vision made him turn sharply. Morag had moved too quickly, stepping back from a side table. Hamish didn't call her out, but he noted it. Every twitch, every slip, every gesture was now evidence in itself. The criminal, he realized, was clever enough to manipulate the pieces, but not careful enough to control instinctive reactions. The thought settled in his mind like ice. If the fragments could be taken so easily, the real culprit was not only bold, but watching closely, prepared to erase the trail at the first hint of discovery. The stakes had risen. What began as a missing quaich and a few ashes had become a deliberate battle over evidence, over control of perception, over the truth itself. Hamish folded his arms, letting the murmurs of the villagers wash over him. The fleck of gold in his pocket felt heavier now, the only solid piece of certainty he had. Whoever had vanished the fragments had underestimated him, leaving behind the smallest clue. It was subtle, almost laughably small to anyone else but to Hamish. It was a lifeline. The real hunt, he knew, was about to begin in earnest, and whoever tried to bury the truth would soon learn that no shred of evidence, however fleeting, could escape a patient and careful eye. Hamish had barely begun to map the possibilities of who could have taken the silver fragments when a sudden scream cut through the frosty morning air, sharp and high-pitched. He spun toward the source, heart instantly alert. From the far end of the village green he could see Morag Mac-Innet running toward the hall, her coat flapping, eyes wide with terror. Behind her a small crowd had gathered, murmuring, gesturing. "What is it?" Hamish called, quickening his pace. They've gone into the smithy," Morag gasped, breathless. "The caretaker he's." Her words broke into panicked gasps, and Hamish caught her arm, steadying her. The hall emptied in an instant as villagers followed, anxious and fearful. Hamish didn't wait for them. He ran toward the smithy, snow crunching underfoot, the cold air stinging his cheeks. When he arrived, the door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. Inside, the workshop was dark, shadows stretching across the walls lined with tools. The caretaker was nowhere to be seen, but the smell of smoke was strong, acrid, and the faint tang of blended whisky lingered. Hamish's eyes adjusted to the dim light, and then he saw it. The floorboards were scorched in a trail leading toward the back. A piece of red wool torn, frayed, unmistakably similar to the scrap he had found before was caught on a nail. "Where is he?" Hamish muttered, scanning the room. The forge itself was cold, the fire long since died. A chair lay overturned. Tools were scattered as if in a struggle. Something had happened here while he was occupied with the haul with the fragments. A movement caught his eye, a shadow slipping past a window at the rear of the smithy, disappearing into the snow-laden alley beyond. Hamish bolted after it, calling the caretaker's name. The alley was empty, the snow pristine except for a single set of footprints leading toward the lock and vanishing at the edge of the frozen water. Hamish paused, analyzing. Whoever had taken the fragments now had escalated. The theft of the Quake's remnants had been a diversion, a probe. Now, someone was prepared to strike physically, to remove witnesses or obstruct the investigation. The careful pattern of deception had shifted into something dangerous, unpredictable. He thought of Morag, still at the smithy's door, clutching her coat. "Did you see who did this?" he asked. "No, it was so fast," she whispered. Her eyes darted nervously. I think someone was watching me, or us." Hamish's mind raced. The fleck of gold in his pocket, the scrap of wool, the vanished caretaker, these were pieces of a trail, yes, but someone had anticipated him observing the fragments too closely. They were clever, patient, and they had the advantage of the element of surprise. He took a deep breath, focusing. The case had grown dangerous. The criminal wasn't content with theft or misdirection. They were escalating. Hamish needed to think not only in terms of past clues, but in terms of future action. Every step the detective took could provoke a reaction. Every hesitation could be exploited. The footprints to the loch gave him little information, disappearing into the white expanse. Whoever had taken the caretaker, or forced him into hiding, knew the village intimately, knew the shortcuts, the blind spots, and the quiet corners where a person could vanish without a trace. Hamish's gaze swept over the alley, the roofs, the fence. As his mind mapping every escape route, he realized then that this wasn't just a missing Quake, not just stolen fragments. This was a test, a calculated escalation to see how far the village would bend before breaking. The criminal was several steps ahead, anticipating every action, willing to threaten life itself to protect the secret of the Vanishing Hogmanay toast. Hamish tightened his coat, slipping the fleck of gold securely into his pocket. The stakes had shifted. He could no longer rely solely on observation and deduction. He would have to anticipate, predict, and act decisively. Someone was in motion, and if he didn't move faster, the consequences would be more than just shattered silver. The mystery had become a race against an unseen adversary, and the next step could be deadly. He set off toward the loch, scanning the snow, listening for the slightest sound, eyes sharp, mind sharper. The game had changed, and Hamish Macbeth knew the village's fate, and perhaps a life or two rested on his next move. Hamish crouched by the frozen loch, snow crunching under his boots, eyes scanning the icy surface and the footprints that led to it. He could see nothing now, no caretaker, no fleeing figure, but his mind was far from blank. Each fragment of evidence, each slip of the witnesses, each subtle reaction he had noted in the hall and the smithy, began to coalesce into a rough shape, like frost forming patterns on a window pane. The pieces didn't fit neatly yet, but a faint outline was emerging, just enough for a trained eye to follow. He thought back to the red scrap of wool, almost trivial on first glance, now linked with Morag's tense movements, the fleck of gold hidden in ash, dismissed by others as insignificant, now hinted at deliberate handling and placement, the blackened log near the hearth, the faint smell of blended whiskey, even the slight scorch marks in the smithy, all these had seemed incidental when taken alone. But together they whispered a story that only Patience could hear. Then it struck him, the timeline itself contained the pattern. The quoit was removed or shattered at the precise moment of the first toast, under the public eye, ensuring distraction. The fragments had been strategically staged near the fire to lure investigators into examining them superficially. The fleck of gold was left deliberately as a subtle breadcrumb, a challenge, a test to see if anyone had noticed the underlying orchestration. The criminal had been careful to misdirect, while leaving just enough for someone persistent to follow. Hamish's gaze shifted as he recalled an offhand comment from the provost during questioning. "We must guard the traditions at all costs." It had seemed a harmless expression of civic pride at the time, but paired with the provost's visible anxiety over the missing silver, it now hinted at obsession and attachment not just to the quoit itself, but to the way it symbolized control. Morag's nervous habit of brushing at her sleeve, previously a minor detail, became significant. She had been aware of the breadcrumbs, aware of the gold fleck and the red wool, and had reacted instinctively just enough to betray herself. Even the caretaker's meticulous routine revealed its hidden message. His access to the logs, his constant movement between the hall and the hearth, his carefully measured speech all had served to mask the timing of the fragment's placement. The smallest of his habitual motions had become the lever that propelled the misdirection. Hamish understood now that the entire crime had been choreographed like a performance, each participant unwittingly playing their part until the final act. He walked back toward the hall, eyes tracing the pattern in his mind. The sequence of events, the arrival, the toast, the missing quoit, the staged fragments, the psychological misdirection, the theft of the evidence, was no longer a series of random incidents. Each action had been deliberate, a calculated step in a plan built to confuse and intimidate. The thief or thieves knew the villagers' routines, their expectations, even their instinctive reactions, and had manipulated all of it to remain several steps ahead. Hamish paused at the doorway of the hall, looking down at the floorboards, the soot-stained ash, the small impressions left by boots and chairs. One particular scuff mark caught his eye, subtle enough to be overlooked, yet positioned precisely near where the tray of fragments had vanished. Its mirror. The way Morag had moved when she brushed against the table earlier, the moment she revealed her nervousness. A faint trail, a repeated gesture, a subconscious signature, it all clicked. The pattern had been in plain sight all along. With a deep breath, Hamish straightened. The solution was no longer abstract. The red wool, the gold fleck, the soot, the footprints, the reactions, all part of a deliberate choreography that revealed both the mind and the method behind the Vanishing Hogmanay toast. The criminal had been audacious, clever and patient, but patience had its limits. Hamish now held the framework of the puzzle, the rhythm of the deception, and the first true sense of the identity that had eluded everyone else. The pattern was clear, and with it came focus. The case that had seemed chaotic, elusive, and fraught with danger now had a tangible path forward. Hamish Macbeth, alert and steady, understood that every step he took from here would be guided by that pattern, each movement calculated to draw the shadowed figure from hiding, and finally expose the truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Hamish sat quietly in the hall long after the villagers had drifted away, letting the soft light of the lamp illuminate the faint scuffs and streaks on the floorboards. He had traced the pattern of movements, the subtle betrayals, and the placement of every clue, and now, with the chaos slowly receding, the motive behind it all began to crystallize in his mind. It was nothing he had expected, nothing simple. This was not theft for gain, revenge for a slight, or a bid for authority. It was something more intimate, more corrosive, something born from fear and obsession. He thought back to the provost, his statements, his anxiety, and the intensity with which he had clung to the traditions of Hogmanay. At first, it had seemed prideful, a normal attachment to custom. But in the light of the pattern, Hamish could see it for what it truly was, an obsession that had festered over generations, a fixation on control and perfection that had twisted into paranoia. The quoit, the toast, the ritual, they were symbols, yes, but symbols of something far more personal a need to dominate not just the celebration, but the memories, identities of those who partook in it. Morag's behaviour, the torn sleeve, the furtive movements, her carefully measured words, they were part of the same web. She hadn't acted out of malice alone, she had been manipulated, drawn into a dance orchestrated by the invisible hand of the Provost's obsession. Hamish remembered the way her eyes had widened when he mentioned the subtle traces, how instinct had betrayed her awareness of the gold fleck in the ash. She had been complicit, but not fully willing the pieces had been moved around her, and she had played her part out of fear, out of a desire to avoid drawing attention to herself, in a village where everyone remembered old grudges. Hamish stood, pacing slowly. The motive had been there all along, hidden behind layers of deception and centuries of tradition. The Provost's family had preserved the Hogmanay rituals obsessively, passing down instructions, warnings, and expectations with a rigid insistence that had created a psychological pressure cooker. That pressure had warped the mind, not into greed, not into simple revenge, but into a need to assert total control over both memory and perception. The vanishing quake, the staged fragments, the theft of evidence, it was all an attempt to test, to manipulate, to see how others would react under the weight of ritual and expectation. Hamish's mind returned to the blackened log, the red wool, the fleck of gold. Each had been a tool, a probe, a small instrument to gauge reactions. The Provost, consumed by his obsession, had been willing to risk not only his reputation, but the safety of others to preserve the illusion that he, and he alone, could control the narrative. He had created a scenario where fear, guilt, and confusion could manipulate the villagers, maintaining his dominance through subtle terror. And yet, there was a brilliance in it, too, a precision that was almost admirable in its calculated cruelty. The criminal had known exactly what he was doing, exploiting human instinct, history, and habit in a way that few could anticipate. Hamish realized that the Vanishing Hogmanay toast wasn't meant to enrich, punish, or even humiliate in the conventional sense. It was meant to prove mastery over the collective mind, to bend a village to a single vision of order, tradition, and control. The full weight of that psychological manipulation settled on him. This was a mind trained to see patterns everywhere, to anticipate the smallest deviations, and to act before anyone else could respond. The Provost's obsession had metastasized into action, and the seemingly trivial pieces, the ash, the fragments, the wool, the misplaced gestures, were all deliberate elements of a larger test of power. Those who failed to perceive it, who reacted instinctively, were merely actors in his carefully constructed scenario. Hamish exhaled slowly, a chill running through him despite the warmth of the hall. The crime was no longer a puzzle of objects or theft, but a window into a psyche willing to manipulate, endanger, and deceive on an almost surgical scale. The truth was horrifying in its clarity. This was a battle not for wealth, not for revenge, not even for pride. It was a battle for perception, memory, and control itself. And Hamish Macbeth, with his patient observation and quiet intuition, was the only one capable of navigating it and stopping the Provost before the next move could become lethal. Hamish spent the remainder of the day moving carefully through the village, quietly observing and confirming what he already suspected. Every subtle gesture, every glance, every habitual movement had been noted, and the pieces of the pattern he had traced over the past days fit perfectly. The Provost's obsession, his meticulous manipulation of events, his reliance on Morag, and the caretaker, everything pointed toward a single, inescapable truth. The Vanishing Hogmanay toast, the staged fragments, even the theft of the evidence, it had all been orchestrated by one mind. A mind now exposed in outline, waiting for the right moment to be caught. As night fell, Hamish returned to the hall, this time with a plan. He placed the remaining fragments of the quoich on a tray in the centre of the room, arranging them as though nothing had happened. He left the red wool visible, though subtly tucked near the hearth, and set a single lamp low, casting long shadows across the floorboards. It was a trap of perception rather than force, designed to tempt the orchestrator into action, to reveal the instinctive moves that would betray guilt. He waited in the shadows, careful to remain unseen, listening to the quiet of the hall. The Provost entered first, pacing near the door, fidgeting with the cuffs of his coat, eyes darting toward the table. Morag followed ostensibly to check the arrangements for the next day, though Hamish could see her apprehension. The caretaker lingered near the back, silent, almost invisible. Hamish observed without movement, focusing on the subtle signs. The Provost's breathing was uneven, his hands twitching, and then, finally, he stepped forward. His gaze locked on the fragments, and he reached instinctively toward them, as though drawn by a force beyond reason. Hamish S.H. noted the slight hesitation in Morag's step, the way the caretaker's fingers brushed against the hem of his jacket, a silent signal, looking for something. Hamish's voice was calm, but it cut through the tense air like a knife. The Provost froze, hand inches from the tray, and turned sharply. "Hamish, you shouldn't be here," he stammered, eyes wide, panic breaking through the carefully maintained composure he had displayed for days. "I thought I'd let you see the pieces," Hamish said quietly, stepping into the lamp's glow. "So you could understand that the pattern has been clear all along. Every movement, every gesture, every subtle misdirection, it all points to you." The Provost's face paled. "No, it wasn't meant to. It was for the village, for the tradition. I only wanted—" His voice faltered, the carefully constructed narrative crumbling under Hamish's gaze. "You wanted control," Hamish said gently, letting the words hang. "Not just of the toast or the quaich, but of how people remember it, how they react, how the story unfolds. You tested them, manipulated them, because you couldn't trust anyone else to preserve the tradition exactly as you believed it should be." The Provost's hands trembled as he stepped back from the tray, realizing that Hamish had anticipated his moves perfectly. Morag tried to speak, but Hamish's quiet glance held her in check. The caretaker's eyes met Hamish's, silent acknowledgment passing between them. They had all played their parts, but the lead orchestrator was exposed. I didn't mean to hurt anyone," the Provost said finally, voice breaking, his obsession laid bare. "I only wanted order, respect, to keep things right." His words faltered into a whisper, and the tension in the room, thick as fog, seemed to lift slightly. Hamish stepped closer, but with measured calm, careful not to provoke a desperate move. "It's over now," he said, "because the truth has been seen. No more misdirection, no more vanishing silver. The village can move forward, and you will answer for the choices you've made." The Provost sagged, the weight of his obsession finally breaking him. Hamish could see the mixture of shame, relief, and fear in his eyes, the complexity of a mind driven to extremes, now rendered human by exposure. Morag exhaled quietly, releasing the tension she had held, and the caretaker stepped forward, a silent witness to the final reckoning. Hamish allowed himself the smallest nod. The pattern had been followed, the motive laid bare, and the orchestrator brought to light. All the pieces, subtle and deliberate, had led to this moment. The Vanishing Hogmanay toast, the staged fragments, the fleck of gold, the red wool, the psychological manipulations, all had converged to reveal the truth. And as the Provost's confession unfolded quietly in the glow of the lamp, Hamish knew the village of Lockdup could finally begin to breathe again. The shadow of obsession lifted, and the mystery resolved. Hamish thought the night's ordeal was over. The Provost had confessed. His obsession laid bare, the pattern of manipulation exposed. The hall was quiet, the lamp casting long, steady shadows across the floorboards, and for the first time in days, it seemed the village could breathe again. Yet Hamish felt the faintest ripple of unease, a whisper at the edge of his mind that told him the story was not yet finished. He lingered near the hearth, examining the last remaining traces of ash, the faint markings on the floor, the scrap of red wool still tucked unobtrusively in the corner. Nothing seemed out of place, but Hamish's instincts told him that the smallest detail could carry the heaviest weight. He moved deliberately, retracing each step, each interaction, each seemingly trivial object that had played a part in the chain of deception. It was then that he noticed it. A subtle indentation on the underside of the table, just at the edge where the Provost had leaned moments before his confession. Almost imperceptible, but deliberate a scratch, faint yet precise, as if someone had pressed a sharp object to leave a mark. It was out of alignment with every other trace he had studied, as if signalling a hidden presence. Hamish's eyes scanned the room. Morag and the caretaker were nearby, subdued and exhausted, yet calm. The Provost slumped in his chair, pale and trembling, but he was clearly not the author of this new trace. Hamish's gut told him to follow the clue, and he crouched, tracing the faint groove with a finger. It led subtly toward a loose floorboard, one that shifted under pressure. Carefully he lifted it, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside, neatly folded, were the missing fragments of the quaich. But there was something else, an envelope, yellowed and fragile with age, addressed not to the Provost, but to Morag. Hamish's brow furrowed. He opened it carefully, and a folded piece of paper fell out. The writing was precise, careful, and chilling. It outlined instructions, timelines, and contingency plans, all pointing to how the quaich should vanish, how the evidence should be manipulated, and how reactions should be observed. Every move the Provost had made, every step he had taken, had been anticipated and guided by these written instructions. Hamish felt a chill. Morag had claimed innocence, Yet here was evidence suggesting someone had planned much of the operation, someone who had operated behind the scenes, invisible to both the villagers and even the provost. He rose slowly, his gaze fixed on her. "Morag," he said quietly, the weight of his voice pressing in the still hall, "this isn't just about observation or instinct. Someone gave instructions, made plans, and anticipated every move. Did you write this?" Morag's eyes widened, but there was no immediate denial. She swallowed hard. I didn't. Her words faltered. Hamish noted the subtle hesitation, the micro-expressions of guilt, fear, and calculation that flickered across her face. The caretaker shifted, uneasy, and Hamish caught a fleeting glance exchanged between him and Morag, a look that spoke of hidden complicity. The layers of deception had deepened. The provost had been a pawn, brilliant in his obsession but manipulated by someone who had orchestrated the scenario from the shadows, someone clever, patient, and willing to remain invisible until the moment of revelation. Hamish exhaled slowly, realizing the genius of the true mastermind. This wasn't about the provost's obsession, or even the village's traditions. It was about control over multiple minds, about shaping events while remaining unseen. Morag's involvement was subtle but undeniable. She had the means, the knowledge, and now, clearly, the plan. The hall seemed to contract around him, every shadow now a potential accomplice. Hamish understood that the final revelation did not undo the previous truths but reframed them entirely. The game was not over. The provost's confession explained only part of the mystery, the visible move, but the hidden hand had been elsewhere all along. Hamish's mind sharpened. The last-minute twist, the revelation of the true orchestrator, was a challenge to his patience, his art, a soning, his skill at seeing through layers of deception. But he welcomed it. Every detail, every instinct, every subtle clue would now be tested to its fullest. The real game was beginning, and Hamish Macbeth, calm and resolute, was ready to follow the unseen trail to its end, even if it led to someone he had never suspected. Hamish stood in the dim hall, the envelope in his hand, eyes narrowing as Morag fidgeted near the doorway. The weight of the hidden plan, she had carried the instructions for the Quake's disappearance. The manipulations of the provost, the orchestration of reactions was undeniable. Yet, as he studied her, he realized that confrontation alone might not yield the answers he needed. She had been clever, patient, and cautious, and one misstep could make her vanish into the village or beyond before justice could touch her. "Morag," he said calmly, voice carrying just enough authority to silence the hall, "the game is over. I know what you planned, what you guided, and how you used the provost to execute it. The fragments, the gold fleck, the red wool, the staged theft of evidence, they were all your markers, your breadcrumbs." Her lips parted, but no words came. Hamish continued, stepping closer yet keeping his tone controlled, almost conversational. "You anticipated every move I made, but you left one constant: instinct. The human element, even when guided, cannot be perfectly masked. Every gesture, every pause, every glance gave you away in the end." She swore, lowed hard, and a flicker of panic crossed her eyes. Hamish's mind raced as he recounted the sequence, speaking aloud not for the villagers but for himself, to map the invisible connection. "The red scrap of wool, seemingly accidental, told me you had been at the hearth before anyone noticed. The fleck of gold in the ash, a subtle mark you didn't expect me to find. Yet it betrayed handling, deliberate yet imperfect. The indentation beneath the table, the loose floorboard, the envelope, it all pointed to a single orchestrator, guiding the chaos from the shadows." Morag's shoulders stiffened, and for a moment Hamish thought she would flee. He stayed still, letting the gravity of observation settle in. "You played everyone," he said softly, "even the provost. You manipulated fear, trust, and tradition, testing each reaction. And yet, here we are. You're exposed because you relied on control alone, forgetting that a patient observer sees the unseen." Her eyes darted toward the window, then the door, calculating, weighing escape. Hamish knew the risk. If she bolted, she could vanish before the authorities, or even the villagers could intervene. Yet he didn't move hastily. He let the tension build, giving her space, while simultaneously closing off the psychological room to maneuver. Finally, Morag spoke, voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want anyone to get hurt. I only wanted to show them." Her words faltered. Hamish noticed the tremor in her hands and the subtle tremble of her lips. Her confession was as much about relief as it was fear. He exhaled slowly, letting the pieces settle. "And in doing so, you created chaos. You tested loyalty, courage, patience, and observation. You underestimated the patient eye." He stepped aside, allowing the villagers to see the envelope and the fragments, ensuring transparency. All the clues, the patterns, the deviations from routine, they pointed to you if one knew where to look. Every instinct, every slip, every seemingly minor inconsistency was a trail waiting for the right mind to follow. That mind has been here all along. Yet as the authorities arrived to secure the evidence, Hamish noted a subtle shift. Morag hesitated at the edge of the crowd, eyes flicking to a side exit, calculating escape. For a brief moment, the possibility that justice might slip through the net tightened around him. But Hamish had anticipated the instinctive reactions, the risk of flight. A discreet hand of a local officer closed the exit, and the tension broke. Morag's plan to remain unseen had failed. Hamish took a step back, observing the resolution. The mystery of the Vanishing Hogmanay toast was now fully revealed, the provost's obsession, the caretaker's unwitting role, and the hidden mastermind in Morag, all pieces of a complex puzzle that had challenged the instincts and logic of the entire village. Justice was served, yet it carried the weight of human frailty, obsession, and ambition, leaving behind a lingering sense of how easily order could be disrupted when minds are manipulated so cleverly. Hamish's gaze swept the room, finally settling on the quietly restored fragment. The lesson, he said quietly, almost to himself, is that truth is rarely obvious. It hides in gestures, in oversights, in the patterns people assume no one notices. The cleverest manipulations always leave traces, however small, for those patient enough to see them. And in the end, even when chaos seems absolute, observation and reasoning prevail. The villagers murmured, some relieved, some still uneasy, but Hamish knew that while the immediate danger was contained, the echoes of the deception would linger, and somewhere in the recesses of Lochtub, the memory of the Vanishing Hogmanay toast would serve as a quiet reminder that even the most invisible manipulations could not escape the careful, unwavering eye of Hamish Macbeth. The village of Lochtub had settled into an uneasy calm. The provost was in the custody of the authorities, Morag was escorted under careful watch, and the caretaker had been relieved of his duties for the night, though unharmed. The hall, once alive with confusion and whispers, now seemed almost serene, the faint glow of the lamp softening the chaos that had consumed it for days. Hamish Macbeth stepped outside into the biting cold, the air crisp and still, and drew in a long breath, letting the tension of the investigation ebb slightly from his shoulders. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he walked toward the edge of the village past shuttered windows and silent streets. The flickering lamplight reflected in the icy surfaces, glinting like tiny stars scattered across the white ground. He allowed himself a small smile, satisfied that the immediate mystery of the Vanishing Hogmanay toast, the staged fragments, the manipulations of obsession and fear had been resolved. The guilty parties were exposed, and justice, however delayed, had been served. Yet, even as relief settled over the village, Hamish's sharp eyes caught something subtle at the edge of the lamplight, a scrap of paper, tearing slightly in the wind, lodged between the roots of a low hedge. Curious, he bent to retrieve it, noting the neat handwriting. It was not large, more like a note hastily concealed, and it bore a single word in careful script, "Observe." There was no signature, no date, no context. Just that one word, crisp and deliberate, as if left for someone who would notice, someone who could interpret it. Hamish turned the note over in his hands. It didn't match any of the handwriting he had seen during the investigation. It was new, unfamiliar, yet intentional. A chill ran down his spine, not from the cold, but from recognition. The village had been manipulated, and perhaps the manipulation was not yet over. He knew instinctively that this was a message, a hint, a breadcrumb intended for the observant eye. Someone wanted to communicate, or warn, or perhaps taunt. The provost and Morag had been revealed, but the game, he realized, might extend beyond them. He pocketed the note carefully, scanning the shadows around him. The streets were silent, the night still, yet the weight of unseen eyes seemed to press upon him. Hamish's mind mapped possibilities. A new player, someone watching from afar, someone patient and calculating enough to remain hidden while sending cryptic signals. It was a familiar sensation, the thrill and caution of a mystery that refused to end neatly, a puzzle that teased and tested his wits beyond what the surface revealed. As he walked further toward the outskirts, past the darkened cottages and silent barns, Hamish's thoughts lingered on the intricate sequence of events. The provost's obsession, the hidden instructions, the careful choreography of reactions that had been an elaborate dance. But the knot, he suggested another rhythm still hidden. A subtle tension remained in the air, almost imperceptible, like the tremor before a storm. The village seemed peaceful, but beneath the surface, Hamish sensed the current of unseen schemes. He paused at the crest of the hill overlooking Loch, wind biting at his face. From this vantage, he could see the entire village, quiet and still under the night sky, the loch frozen like a sheet of silver. He allowed himself a moment to reflect, the case closed in the eyes of the villagers, but far from settled in his mind. Mysteries, he knew, rarely concluded in simple resolutions. They left traces, questions, and the faint echo of something overlooked. Hamish Macbeth tucked the note safely into his coat pocket, letting the snowflakes drift around him. The village would celebrate the next Hogmanay unaware of the complexity that had almost unravelled it. Yet he knew that somewhere in the shadows, the quiet architect of subtle clues remained, waiting for the right moment to surface again, and Hamish, patient and unflinching, would be ready to follow wherever the next whisper of a mystery might lead. With a final glance at the shimmering loch and the sleeping village, he turned back toward the hall, footsteps deliberate in the snow. Justice had been served, yet a lingering question remained, an unsettled edge to the night, a reminder that in Loch mysteries never truly end. And as he walked, a small, knowing smile crossed his face. For Hamish and Macbeth understood that the thrill of the unseen, the delicate trail of observation, would always call him back. The game continued, and he would be ready.